All right, Reddit friends, Facebook friends, and real life friends. I am answering some questions. I've been taking questions for the last few days on Reddit and Facebook, and I've compiled them all together and gonna have a little talk about some of the things you guys have been curious about while I was out in Labrador. So I'm gonna split it up into sections. Gear, food and hunting, miscellaneous questions, production related questions, and I'll chop it all up in the video. So just go down to the bottom of the link if there's anything specifically you're curious about, any specific topic, and you can fast forward to it. So, first question. If you went out there again, would you make any changes to the 10 items you brought? Yes. If I was going back knowing what I know now, I probably would not take my trapping wire. I brought 2 pounds of trapping wire as one of my food procurement items, and I didn't really end up using it that much. My area, there was almost no hares whatsoever, except way out in the back, and I didn't kind of discover that until the very end. So it would have just been really trapping squirrels and setting up the traps and running that trap line, checking that trap line every day just to potentially maybe bag a squirrel or two here and there didn't feel like a worthwhile calorie investment. So if I was going to do it again, I'd probably switch out the trapping wire for a slingshot, because there were a lot of times where the squirrels or the grouse would flush up super high into a tree and kind of be up where I wouldn't feel safe taking a shot, because obviously you only have 9 arrows with your bow, and I only had 3 flu arrows with that. So there were a few times many times really, where I just had no opportunity to take a shot on those grouse or on those squirrel. But with a slingshot, I could just have a pocket full of pebbles and the BBs that they take with you, and just plink away at them until I hit them. And I felt like that would have been a really valuable item to have. Okay, next question. What backpack did you use? We all got the same pack. It's a Kelty Coyote 105. Seems like a solid pack. Really, it was just loaded with stuff. Once I got there, it kind of sat there. Once the shelter was built, it just kind of sat in the shelter. Didn't actually do much backpacking with it. For the one photograph you're allowed to bring, can that be a photograph of helpful information to use in the wild? No. As far as I know, the photograph has to be of your loved ones, or maybe something else, but it can't give you any advantage. They're really trying. They try very hard to make sure we're all on the same level playing field when we go out there. So if you could start taking like a little food plant ID or something like that, that wouldn't fly, because it would just give you too much of an advantage, and everyone would probably do it. Okay. Would you change your 10 items you brought with you? Okay, we already answered that. Are there some items that are just non-negotiable and any aspiring player must include? Yeah, I think there's definitely a few items that would be pretty silly not to take out. A sharp cutting edge is probably one of the hardest things to replicate out in the wild. So an axe, I think first and foremost, is always going to be a pretty critical item. I know a couple of the other guys, Jordan and Roland, for example, have said if they could only take one thing out there with them, it would be their axe. And I'm not sure if I would go as far as to say that, but I definitely think it's pretty handy. Same for the multi-tool, the knife. You're just going to have a really hard time replicating a sharp cutting edge out there. So it's taking something sharp is definitely a non-negotiable for me, at least. A cooking pot, I think, is another one that is pretty much a non-negotiable. Like you can get away with using hot stones and a hollowed out bowl and da da da, but it's like, come on, like that's a lot of a lot of faff, a lot of BS just to try and boil some water, make some tea, cook a stew, that sort of thing. So I think pretty much cooking pot's a go-to, and the same with a sleeping bag. You I mean, you could maybe get away with a sleeping bag, but like, why would you want to? Like maybe make a debris hut and pile all the stuff and stuff your clothes and that sort of thing. But you get 10 items, and that's definitely one of the 10 that would seem really foolish to go without. I think those are probably definitely the 3 most important non-negotiables for me. If one of your items you brought could be any item, what would it be? The only limitations is that it has to fit in your backpack. That's a really fun question. I like that one. I think there's probably a few things that would just make life so much easier out there. Like, I can't tell you how many times when I thought, man, I wish I had my fly rod. Because, casting with like a bushcrafted rod, you're only getting so far out, maybe 15, 20 feet on a good cast. But, if I had my fly rod, you're on one of the best fly fishing rivers in the world. And being out there just flicking a stick into the water, it felt pretty annoying at times. So fly rod would be a nice one. Pack down 22 rifle again, like just being able to plink off those birds and those grouse from whatever distance would be pretty nice. And then maybe this one doesn't quite fit in the backpack, but chainsaw would be a pretty handy item out there as well for processing firewood and for shelter building. Just make short work of all of that. If you could go back in time and be part of any expedition, which would it be? Probably the Kon-Tiki expedition. In the 1940s, a Scandinavian dude called Thor Heyerdahl supposed that the South Pacific Islands were originally inhabited by South Americans, whereas the prevalent theory at the time was that they had been inhabited from Asia. And nobody believed him. He had some fairly compelling evidence to support his theory, but it was so far-fetched that anthropologists kind of laughed him out of the room. He figured that the only way to prove his theory was to do it. So he convinced a few of his buddies from the war to come and join him, and they built a massive balsa wood raft, and they pushed off from the coast of Peru in the late 1940s and just frickin' went for it, man. And it totally worked. 4 months later, they drifted up into one of the South Pacific island atolls and kind of made history. But that has always, to me, has stood out as the epitome of adventure. Just really just casting off into the great unknown to test a theory that most wouldn't believe possible. Incidentally, it didn't actually turn out to be accurate. Once they were able to do DNA testing, it did turn out that the Pacific Islands were peopled from the people of Asia. So that kind of makes it even crazier that it worked out anyway. So I have mad respect for Dor and the other guys, and that's definitely one that would have been pretty awesome to be on. All right, random question. How bad did you stink by the end? I probably stunk pretty bad. I mean, I couldn't smell myself really. Like, once I took off all my layers and I was just kind of like, if I sniffed my pits from my base layer, yeah, they were pretty ripe. But I was wearing the same base layers for like 40 days. But I think probably with all my clothes on, mostly just smelled like wood smoke. You're getting wood smoke on you every single day, and that's going to be pretty much like the predominant odor when you're out there. And I think also when it comes to like stinking, like I tried to keep myself fairly clean. I bathed regularly. I would heat up a pot of water, and I had like a washcloth, and I would put some spruce needles in there and try and just stay clean, because honestly, psychologically, like being clean is a huge help to your psyche, for staying positive and just feeling human while you're out there. So I stink, but probably not as bad as some of the other people. Did you consider any ways to game the item system, in the vein of the person that brought a toothbrush that could be made into a lure, or Tom dyeing his hair? If so, how/why did you or did you not do it? I think everyone's trying to come up with creative ways to use their items or to use their clothing while they were out there. I knew that we were going to be in a fly fishing zone, so I was looking for ways to incorporate like colorful material that I could use for making flies. They did show in one of the episodes me making a fly out of a little piece of my boot insole, which I had put bright orange insoles into my boot, knowing that I would use one of those pieces. My mom also made me a wool scarf, and at the ends of the scarf I had her felt in some brightly dyed alpaca wool, in blues and purples and reds. And I pulled that out of the scarf and made flies with that as well. I also knew that I'd be using my tarp for a lot of stuff, so I don't think anyone's ever utilized a tarp in the same way that I have, just as far as the number of different things that I did with it. I took it instead of the cordage, and one of the first things I did when I arrived was I cut really thin strips off the tarp, and I used those as cordage for building my shelter. And if I needed stronger cordage, I actually braided about 40 feet of the tarp as well, to use for kind of like really strong stuff. And once you braided that reinforced tarp, it was actually pretty burly. It was good material. So I think we're all trying to come up with ways to be creative, but I probably worked within the limitations of the rules as much as possible. How would you compare and contrast being alone on a boat in the ocean versus being alone in the wilderness? It's a great question. I mean, both times you're alone in the wilderness. The ocean is a vast wilderness, and a pretty uninhabitable one at that. But obviously, when you're on the boat, you have a different level of comfort. I was well fed. I had music, I had books, I had a freaking Kindle with like 6,000 books on it, and I would read for 4 or 5 hours every day. I wasn't cold, except for towards the end as I was heading further down out of the tropics into New Zealand. Some of the storms got pretty cold at that towards the end of the season, but not cold like it was out in Labrador. So those psychological factors definitely worked in my favor, being out at sea. The other advantage is that when you're out at sea and you're working towards a destination, you kind of know roughly how many days you've got left. So my longest passage was from the Galapagos to the Marquesas in French Polynesia. That was 3,400 miles roughly, and it took me 23 days. So the longest I had to go completely alone at sea was 23 days, and I knew that there was kind of an end date. By the end of it, I was like, man, I'm not feeling too bad, but I could really use a cold beer and a nice conversation. And of course, being out in Labrador, I blew past that mark. And there's definitely something psychologically different about the open-ended nature of the isolation in Labrador. You don't know when it's going to end. You don't know how much longer you have. You don't know how much more you have in the tank, and that plays on your mind every single day. But that being said, being at sea is a whole different level of isolation. I didn't have a safety team 5 miles away. I didn't have a tap out button. I didn't have a radio to communicate with people. I was well and truly alone, and my life completely 100% depended upon that boat and me being able to get that boat to the next landfall. So I think, taken as a whole, the sailing trip was the more difficult experience of the two. But the psychological and physical toll of being in Labrador was probably more taxing to my body and to my mind. What is your stance on silly songs? I love silly songs. I do wonder if the question is, do you think that the producers put too many silly songs in the show? And I am of the opinion that everybody's experience should be portrayed as honestly as possible. And if there's a contestant who is out there and every single day they're belting out a tune and that's what's getting them through the day, then that's honest. That's real. And the thing that I appreciate about Alone is that it is the realest reality TV out there. So them cutting it out just to satisfy the grumps out there that all they want to see is all I want to see is fishing and hunting. I'm gonna fast forward through everything else. It's like, that's fine. You can fast forward through it, but that's not the reality of the experience. We're not just like fishing and hunting robots that are out there mechanically going through the motions to win $500,000. Like, we're all people, and a lot of the people who are out there are creative and have strong creative outlets within their lives that help get them through difficult times. For me, it's cracking jokes. Like, I try to make myself laugh every day, and the stupider and the dumber that I was, the more entertained that I was, and the better time I was having. And I feel that came through on the edit, and the editors portrayed that honestly. But as far as people singing silly songs, I say more power to you, man. Let's do it. And if you don't like it, you can just fast forward or press mute. No big deal. What did you wipe your butt with? I'm very actually kind of surprised at how many people are curious about what I wipe my ass with. I've been asked that several times. Moss. Mostly moss. It's actually really, really nice. And I was using different moss from the moss in my house. Plenty of moss out there, but a little like slightly wet moss. It's like a wet wipe for your butt. It's pretty good. I think Tom was telling me that he used rocks, like smooth rocks, which I've never tried before, but apparently he swears by now. So if you're ever out in the wild and you don't have any TP, and there's no moss, try a rock, man. See how that works. How long were you a fan of Alone before you decided to enter yourself? I had heard about the show years ago, all the way back in season 1, but I didn't actually watch the show until the pandemic. I was kind of sequestered in my house back in 2020, just like pretty much everybody else. I was watching a lot of TV, and I decided to watch it, and I watched a couple of the earlier seasons, and it was off the back of watching those earlier seasons that I said, reckon I could probably do that. So I watched maybe a couple of seasons, I think like season 2, season 3, or something like that. And that was send them an email, and I applied. After I had applied, I kept watching through the rest of the seasons, and I watched like 6 and 7. And I was like, okay, well, these guys are pretty hardcore. The show's evolved a little bit. Now the people in 2 and 3 weren't hardcore. There's some hardcore mofos in there as well. But like the overall quality and consistency of the candidates, of the contestants every season, the bar is just getting higher and higher. So I'm happy that I applied after watching the early seasons, because maybe I wouldn't have done, and then I would be sitting here. But I'm a pretty big fan now. I love the show. I think it's great. I don't really watch that much TV. What is the most trivial or mundane thing that bothered you or you missed? Really trivial. I missed having a wristwatch on. Like, I normally always have a wristwatch on, and not being able to like know the time kind of bothered me early on, at least, until I kind of like absorbed into the kind of cycle, the daily cycle out there. I missed having a pillow. Like, not that that's that big of a deal, but again, if we're talking trivial and mundane, like a folded up sweater just ain't quite the same, you know. All right. Did you take any souvenirs back from Labrador? Yeah, I got one. Got one souvenir. This is the hare that I shot on day 40 whatever. Hey, buddy. And I case skinned it and dried it out and brought it back with me. It's a pretty nice little souvenir. And I got a couple of spoons and stuff like that. Most of that stuff I gave away. How does this experience compare to your sea travels? We kind of answered that one already. When they ask you, will you compete again? Yes. I would. If they called me today, I'd be on the plane tomorrow. I'm ready. I would love to have another crack at it. And we'll see how it goes. Okay, we're going to go into some of the mental, psychological type questions. I would love to hear your thoughts, insights, and approach to psychological survival in such isolation. I think this is a great question. And it's definitely one thing that doesn't get maybe quite enough attention. So many people kind of like to talk about the items they would bring or the clothing, and definitely when you're preparing for the show, you get really sucked into the minutia of what are my 10 items going to be? What clothing am I going to take? Practicing your bow, practicing trapping, all of these different skills. And honestly, getting your head right, so important. Because if you are not 100% mentally fit and healthy, the isolation will tear you apart. Any skeletons in your closet, any big blowout arguments you have with your loved ones, anything you left undone is gonna chew you up out there. So it's so important to get yourself in a good place mentally before you do anything like this. I think it's also really important to know honestly what your reasons for being out there are, because you will doubt them. you'll question them. And any kind of armor that you put up, a lot of people talk about compartmentalizing while they're out there. Just, they put their family to the side, they put their job to the side, they put all those lingering doubts to the side, and they're compartmentalizing. And I don't think that works very well in the long term. I think eventually those walls will break down, and by trying to avoid thinking about them, they're liable to bite you in the ass even harder. So I think it's better to just let it flow. If you're feeling homesick, allow yourself to feel homesick. Don't force it out. Just let it flow through you. I think that's a really, really important tool. And recognizing and acknowledging when you're sad is also really important, because the emotions that you feel out there, they're going to be really, really powerful and potent, and unlike anything you've ever felt before. I've been away from home for months and months on end, years on end, in my travels and adventures and away for work. I'm gone probably 6 months out of the year, and nothing hit me like it did out there. So it's good to recognize that you may think you're a badass, and you may think that you're mentally strong, but be humble and be aware of the cracks in your armor, because they're there and they'll be exposed. So you got to be honest with yourself. There's so much more I could say about that, but that could be a whole separate video. So we're just going to move on. I would like to know if you would go more in depth to your thought process or decision making behind your tap out. Could you walk us through what Adam in that moment imagined Adam not tapping at that point would look like? What kind of condition did you imagine you'd be in? What kind of food did you imagine you'd be able to get in that time, if any at all? How much longer you realistically could have gone before being medically pulled? Why exactly did you decide against doing so and remaining? Okay, there's a lot there. So let's start with my decision-making reasoning behind my tap out. So I feel like the producers did a pretty good job of kind of showing my thought process behind my tap. I had been out there for about 51, 52 days. And every 10 days I looked at my body. And I've done a lot of weight cuts in my life. And normally I sit at around 185 and 185 to 190. And I went out there at 215, which is the heaviest I've ever been in my adult life. And I know what my body looks like at 190, 180, 170. And I knew that I was getting into the 150s. And before I went out there, I told myself, I've got about 60 pounds to lose. That's the leeway that I gave myself. And I had felt like if I could make it to day 60 and still have a little bit of weight left, or be close to that mark, I would push it to the limit, because maybe I could glide through to another 10 or 15, 20 days for $500,000. But to be at that point at day 50, knowing that you're looking at 20 to 30 days left, it just didn't feel like things were sustainable. I knew I was losing over a pound of weight a day, because I know my body. And in the end, I just was looking at myself, and it wasn't just the weight loss, it was the exhaustion. I was feeling the cold worse than I've ever felt in my life, just because there was just no calories to keep me warm. A few other contestants have talked about that in the past. And it's true. Like, I was such a cold baby. I couldn't keep my hands warm. I couldn't keep my feet warm. There just wasn't the fuel there to do it. And when I started losing motor function in my legs, when I started kind of like tripping on things in the forest and stumbling, you'll actually notice it's just a little scar on my tap out right there between my face. And that was actually me tripping on something while walking, and I fell into a branch and it cut me right there. But I mean, like, it could have poked my freaking eye out. It was pretty close. Not a big deal in and of itself. You know, people trip and fall all the time. But taken as a whole, all of it, plus the fact that I had no food saved up. Despite all my best efforts, you know, at one point before I got sick, I had 3 or 4 grouse put away. And then when I got sick, I was sick for like a week. That's one thing that didn't quite come through on the edit. I was laid low for a while. And all of the firewood that I had saved up, I had like maybe 10 days worth of firewood. I had probably about a week's worth of food. I just had to blow through all of it because I just couldn't really go anywhere, do anything. And I never quite caught up again. I was living hand to mouth, and I was doing quite well. I mean, I was roughly eating a grouse to half a grouse every day, berries. Mushrooms were holding out until about day 40. So I was able to fill my pot pretty much every night, but there was never enough to build up my reserves. So I got to this point at day 50 where the snow was coming down, the mushrooms were done. There would be no more. The fish had been done at my site for weeks, and all of the grouse within my direct kind of 2-hour area were gone. I mean, I had just blown through them all. I'd killed over 20 grouse at that point. So I was left in a situation where there were a few berries way off in the back of my site that I could still harvest. But once the snow came, they would be very difficult to harvest as well, probably impossible. And maybe the occasional grouse. But I just had no food left. And I just made that call. What would have made me change my mind was some shift in that. So I went back, once I found that other river, I went back a few times. And by the second time I went back, it had frozen over. I just missed the window. But if I had found and was able to hunt a beaver out there, if I'd found a couple more hares, some kind of larger game, that would have shifted my calorie equation. A single beaver could have potentially kept me well fed for a week. And that extra week might have been what I needed to power through those last 2 or 3 or however many weeks it may have been. But at that point, I felt like it was too early in the game to try and power through with what I have left. So I just made the call. How much longer realistically could I have gone before being medically pulled? Probably 10 days, I would say. If I was going to continue to lose a pound a day, so maybe if I had just laid up in my shelter and done nothing, maybe 2 weeks. But then that would have got me into the mid-60s. And with the quality of the contestants that we had out there, I just didn't see that being realistic. Where do you spend most of your downtime? As in, did you rest in your shelter? Did you have a favorite spot in the woods that you enjoyed being? I had a really great spot just up on the hill above my shelter. So my shelter was nestled in a little valley that was really well sheltered from the wind and the weather. And then there was 2 bald hills on either side. and the hill closest to my shelter, I would go up there every day, and I would watch the sunset, and I would watch the world go by. I loved hanging out on that spot as long as the weather was good. I also spent a fair amount of time hanging out in my camp as well. Usually not in my shelter during the day. I'd sit on my bench. I did a lot of sitting on that bench, whittling spoons and just hanging out and bullshitting to the camera. How difficult was it for you to see yourself losing all of that weight, even though you were eating? It was pretty shocking. I lost a lot of weight in the first few weeks. I think I probably lost 30 pounds in 20 days. And I think a lot of that comes down to the weight that you're gaining in preparation for the show. It tends to fall off you because your body's not used to holding that extra weight. So, I call it fluff. And I had this just extra 25 pounds of fluff that just disappeared so quickly, especially because in the first 10 days, I was putting a lot of extra calories into building my shelter. And I built my shelter in 6 days, but, I was putting in a proper day of construction, same as I would at home. And eating maybe 500 or 700 calories in trout and mushrooms. That was back when I was eating trout a lot. So, the weight just went quick, and that was pretty shocking. But after I kind of got used to the idea and I saw that was starting to slow and get steady, I kind of got used to it, and I realized I was like, this is okay. But you do have a red line, and obviously that played a part in my tap out. What was a challenge you faced that you weren't anticipating that caught you by surprise? Being homesick. That really caught me off guard. I knew I was going to be homesick. Obviously, I knew that I was going to miss my family and my girlfriend and my dog and my house and blah blah blah. But I had never dealt with it to that degree. And it was actually more. I had this strange feeling that something wasn't right at home. I was worried that someone had caught COVID, and both of my parents are pretty high risk for COVID. They various kind of health issues or whatever that they have would have made it a pretty scary proposition. And there was a couple of times where I would hear the boat going by and think that they were coming to tell me that someone in my family had died. Those are the games that my brain was playing on me, the tricks it was playing on me. So that was a big challenge, and I had to work really hard to moderate that and to assure myself, no, everybody's fine. Everything's fine. Just, you're on your own journey here. So that was a challenge that I did not expect. Insomnia was another one. I slept really badly for the last 20 days. I would wake up around 10 or 11 and have hunger pangs that would keep me up through the night. And my brain would also not shut down. My brain was so preoccupied during the day with hunting and fishing and firewood gathering and all of the kind of day-to-day things that you needed to keep yourself alive. I wasn't really thinking creatively. I wasn't allowing myself to think creatively or imagining future things or that sort of thing. But when I would go to bed and I'd be laying in my bag, because obviously you're in your bag for 12 hours at a time, your mind wanders and it gets really hard to shut it off. So between the hunger pangs and my brain just being in overdrive, I would go a day or two without sleeping sometimes, and it was really hard. And that was really I did not suspect that. All right, production, behind the scenes kind of stuff. And this one kind of goes maybe more into some of the other previous questions. But how much weight did you lose? So I went out at 215, and I believe I came back at 158. So I lost about 56 or 57 pounds while I was out there. which is a lot. That's skinnier than I've ever been since maybe like junior high or like early high school. It was a lot of weight to come off my body real quick, and obviously like I've put it all back on, shy of maybe 10 pounds, which is weird because I'm sitting probably like 10 or 15 pounds heavier than I normally do, and it's been really hard to try and lose that weight because I think my body is still just clinging to it because we went through a starvation period, a pretty substantial starvation period, and now my metabolism is just kind of doing everything it can to hold extra weight in case it happens again. So it's been an interesting challenge. Does having the camera there make you not feel alone? I've always wondered about this, because in a way you're with millions of other people who might hear and see what you're up to. The camera definitely helps. It's one of the reasons I think, well, it's definitely one of the reasons why they don't let you have a journal or anything like that, because they really want you to put it all out there on camera and use that as your diary. And after a while, yeah, you really come to confide in the camera, and you kind of forget that there's going to be millions of people watching. And that happens pretty quick in the process. You get to a point where like you're just talking to the camera, like it's like your mute buddy. And yeah, it's really easy to forget, like, oh yeah, I'm not going to be the only one watching this. There's going to be a lot of random and some very judgmental strangers who are going to be analyzing your every move. But it's better really not to think about that while you're out there, because it will massively affect your performance. And I just kind of let it all out. I laid it on the line because I don't really care what anybody else thinks. And the camera did help me. I liked working with the cameras. It was fun. And it was definitely a way to talk through things. What do you think is your most memorable experience in the process of getting on the show, going out there, and recovering afterwards? Getting on the show was wild. I didn't really expect to make it into the final 10. Just because going through the boot camp process where there's 24, 25 people, there's so many talented people in that group. I like any one of those 25 could have made it into the final cut, and I wouldn't have been surprised. And, it's a pretty elite group of people. 50,000 people apply for the show every year. And, here I am, just some Joe Schmo from Arkansas. I don't have a social media following. I don't have a YouTube. I'm not a survival instructor. I wasn't headhunted. I was, I'm just out of the slush pile from the emails. So I always thought it was kind of a long shot, and definitely getting that call right here in this house that I had made the cut. I'll never forget that. That was like a life-changing moment for me, and I'm so freaking stoked that it happened. Going out there was a crazy experience. Just flying out to Labrador with all my shit and meeting all these people who I had been chatting back and forth with some of them via WhatsApp and telephone for months at that point, and getting to meet up with everybody and go out to the base camp. It was so exciting, like everybody was just so amped up, and like there'd been so much build up at that point that everyone was just like really wired up and ready to go. And, I made some great friends. Great friends. And as far as the recovery, there was definitely some memorable experience coming back to camp and going through the recovery process before I could head home, and processing the experience and reintegrating into society. Noises were really sharp. There was a couple of generators running the base camp, and everything just seemed so freaking noisy, all of it. Helicopters going back and forth, and I was just so wired up. My senses were so attuned to noise and to taste and to smell that I felt like a human animal. and more so than I'd ever have in my life. So like that was a really memorable experience. And obviously Tom was still there, and Tom and I bonded quite a lot during that time. He was really there for me, as he had been, obviously, and Jesse too had been at camp for a while, and had kind of gone through that reintegration process a little bit already, and he was able to help me kind of mentally process, and definitely a shoulder to cry on one or two nights. And I mean, he's a good friend, he's a good man, he's a very, very good man. Jesse's a great person as well, like both of them, A+ solid human beings. And the memories that I made with them back there was very special. Did you ever sit back and watch anything you filmed on the camera as entertainment while you were out there? No, I didn't watch any of it. Occasionally, I would quickly check on the GoPro if I had made a kill shot on something and I wanted to make sure that I got a good shot of it on camera. But other than that, like the skits and like me just talking to the camera, it's like hearing it once was enough. Like I don't want to listen to myself talk. So no, I didn't do that. Are you sequestered after tapping? Was your mama happy to see you? What was the special dinner she made for you on returning home? Of course, my mom was happy to see me. She couldn't wait to see me. And I actually got back like right around Thanksgiving. So the first time I saw them was Thanksgiving dinner. And we had a lovely meal. And it was delicious. I couldn't eat that much still at that point. I actually made myself feel a little bit sick. But it was very special. That was great. And yes, you stay at base camp for a little while after you tap, just to kind of make sure that you're healthy and you're okay, and that mentally everything's good, and just to decompress, and also logistically to organize your flights home and stuff. So you're there for a while, which is great. I mean, that's definitely, you need that time. It would not be great to just jump straight on the plane and go straight home after all of that. It's nice to have a little bit of downtime. How many / which of your pre-planned ideas worked out, and how many did you have to change unexpectedly? I didn't actually have that many pre-planned ideas. I was just going to kind of go out there, and I wanted to wait until I saw my site and saw what I had. But definitely, there were a couple of things that I was certainly hoping for. I definitely was hoping for a shot on a bear, and that didn't work out. I worked pretty darn hard at that, but it never manifested. And I was hoping to have a site where I can make a boat, but the stretch of river that I was on was quite shallow and swift and broad and featureless, and there were only one or two spots where I could actually easily get in and out of the water. 2 little tiny beaches on my whole site. The rest, it was like thick alders right up to the shore. So I was worried, if I was going to make a boat, about potentially losing my oar or slipping off downstream and not being able to get back in, and potentially being in a somewhat dangerous situation. So that was a no-go for me on my site. That didn't work out, unfortunately. Can you hear the helicopters for the other tap outs? Or are there many helicopter trips for medical checks? I was actually the first person to be taken out by helicopter. Everybody else had boats. And that was because the river had frozen over by that point. But you learn pretty quickly not to read too much into any kind of noise or activity that you hear from the production team, whether that's a boat or a helicopter or whatever. You do occasionally hear some noises, but you'd drive yourself crazy speculating every time you heard a boat, like, oh, someone tap out. So I didn't really think about it.